A detective enters an abandoned high school classroom, desk arranged perfectly, chalk lesson frozen mid-sentence, 40 years of dust swirling in the dying afternoon light. On the blackboard, Lesson 1, The Ones Who Stay. In a faded class photo, half the faces are circled in red, and every name below them reads, Missing.
Welcome to the Haunted Horror Half-hour horror stories that haunt your mind.
The bell rang too sharply that Monday morning, as if the sound itself were startled to still be in use. Carla slid into her desk while the rest of homeroom buzzed with half-sleep chatter. Their regular English teacher, Mr. Kelman, was out sick, again. The woman who walked in wasn't what anyone expected. She was tall and pale, her gray skirt pressed to perfection, her hair swept into a bun so tight it looked carved from marble. "Good morning, class," she said, voice crisp yet calm, the kind teachers use when they already know they'll never need to shout. She erased the board with long, deliberate strokes, though it had already been clean, and wrote in flawless cursive, Ms. Hampton. She smelled faintly of chalk dust, not the normal kind, but something older, layered with sweetness that reminded Carla uneasily of wilted lilies left too long in a vase. "Where's Mr. Kelman?" Logan whispered behind her. Ms. Hampton smiled without turning around. "He's resting. He told me you'd all be exceptionally bright today." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, but Ms. Hampton didn't laugh with them. She simply placed a piece of chalk on the edge and began the lesson. Her handwriting belonged to another century. Loops too elegant for ballpoint pens. She spoke about symbolism in the road not taken, yet her examples were oddly specific. "When your school was first built," she said, "students often took that same road by the creek after football games." Carla frowned. That road had been closed since before her parents even met. Between notes, Carla glanced around. No one else seemed bothered, but the air kept getting thicker, as though every breath borrowed space from something invisible. The old ceiling fan, never reliable, groaned and stopped entirely. Ms. Hampton didn't look up. Her eyes, gray as slate, stayed on Carla's notebook. "That's fine handwriting," she murmured. "You'd do well in my advanced class." Carla wasn't taking an advanced class. She didn't even know one existed. When the bell rang, no one moved at first. It felt like leaving would be rude. Ms. Hampton stood by the doorway, thanking them one by one, her hand resting lightly on each shoulder. Her touch was cool and dry, like paper forgotten in an attic. Outside in the hall, Carla turned back through the small window in the classroom door. Ms. Hampton hadn't left. She was staring at the chalkboard again. But the board now read Lesson 1, The Ones Who Stay. Carla blinked. When she looked again, the words were gone. By Wednesday, Carla had heard the same lesson 3 times, word for word. Ms. Hampton stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, reciting the identical opening. "Poetry is the architecture of emotion. Today we'll explore Robert Frost's diverging paths." The same pause, the same tilt of her head. Even the way she tapped the chalk against the board, twice, then once, was exactly as it had been Monday. Carla glanced at her classmates. No one else seemed to notice. Sophie was doodling hearts in her margins. Logan scrolled through his phone under the desk. But when Miss Hampton spoke, they all looked up with the same glassy attention, like puppets jerked by invisible strings. "The road less traveled," Miss Hampton continued, "is not always the road we choose. Sometimes it chooses us." Carla's pen hovered over her notebook. She'd written these exact notes twice already. The ink from Monday had bled slightly through the page, creating a ghost sentence beneath today's words. She flipped back. Identical. Every sentence. Every comma. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, a mosquito whine that made her head ache. The room felt smaller than yesterday, the walls closer, as if the space itself were inhaling. Miss Hampton's smile never wavered. During lunch, Carla cornered Sophie by the lockers. Has Miss Hampton said anything different in English? Sophie shrugged, spinning her combination lock. I don't know. She's nice though. Way better than Kelman. She's been teaching the same lesson for 3 days. So? Kelman used to just play documentaries and nap. Sophie's locker popped open, and a folded paper fluttered out. She caught it, frowning. Weird. I didn't put this here. It was a hall pass, handwritten in perfect cursive. Sophie Ramirez. Excused to room 13. Study session. No date, no signature. Just that faint, sweet smell. Carla's stomach dropped. Don't go. It's probably just... don't. But Sophie was already walking away, tucking the pass into her pocket. After school, Carla went to the main office. The secretary, Mrs. Brennan, barely looked up from her crossword. I need to see Miss Hampton's employee file. Substitutes don't have files here, honey. They're contracted through the district. Can you call the district? Mrs. Brennan sighed, picked up the phone, dialed. A long pause. Her expression shifted. Confusion, then unease. She hung up slowly. They say they never sent anyone named Hampton. The hallway behind Carla grew cold. She turned. Ms. Hampton stood at the far end, backlit by the dying afternoon sun. She wasn't moving, just watching. In her hand, she held a piece of chalk, rolling it between her fingers like a cigarette. When Carla blinked, she was gone. But on the wall where she'd been standing, written in fresh white dust, Lesson 2, The Ones Who Remember. The library was a tomb of silence, lit only by the flickering green glow of an exit sign. Carla's hands were slick with sweat as she navigated the narrow space between the reference section and the teacher's lounge. She knew Ms. Hampton spent her lunch hour here, but she never went to the cafeteria. She stayed in the shadows, waiting. Ms. Hampton's leather satchel sat on the low oak table, looking older than the building itself. It was worn to a dark, oily sheen, smelling intensely of that sweet, rotting lily scent. Carla's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached for the brass buckle. It was ice cold, the metal stinging her skin. Inside, there were no lesson plans, no red pens, no half-eaten sandwiches. There were only yearbooks. Carla pulled out the top one, Lincoln High, 1984. She flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, the smell of old glue and dust rising like a physical weight. In the sophomore section, a face was circled in thick, dark red ink. The ink looked wet, reflecting the dim light. David Miller. She grabbed another. St. Jude's, 1996. Another circle. Maya Thorne. Each book was from a different school, across different decades, but the pattern was the same. Every circled student shared a specific look. Bright, wide-eyed, the kind of kids who won every debate and wrote every poem. And beneath each photo, a date was scrawled in Ms. Hampton's elegant, looping cursive. Final grade. Perfect. A cold draft swept through the library, rustling the pages. Carla's breath hitched as she saw the last book in the bag. It was her own school's current digital yearbook proof, printed on high-gloss paper. She turned to the S section. A red circle, still tacky to the touch, surrounded Sophie's smiling face. But it was the notes in the margin that made Carla's stomach turn. Ms. Hampton had written, promising, almost architecture. Then Carla saw her own name. No circle, not yet. Just a single jagged line beneath her photo and a question mark that looked like a hook. A floorboard groaned behind her. "It's rude to grade a teacher's work before the final exam, Carla." Carla spun around. Miss Hampton stood in the dark aisle, her form silhouetted by the moonlight. She was clutching a fountain pen, the nab dripping a dark, iron-smelling fluid that wasn't quite ink. In the shadows, Miss Hampton's gray eyes didn't just look slate. They looked hollow, like two holes cut out of a photograph. "I've taught in so many rooms," Miss Hampton whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "But your class? You're almost ready for the permanent collection." She stepped into the light, and for a split second, the reflection in a nearby trophy case didn't show the bun and the gray skirt. It showed a woman in a high-collared Victorian dress, her skin as gray as the chalk she used to write the names of the dead. By Thursday morning, the classroom was cold enough to see breath. Carla noticed it the moment she stepped into room 13. The hallway outside buzzed with normal school noise, lockers slamming, laughter, sneakers squeaking, but the air inside the classroom felt dead and sealed, like the inside of a freezer that had been shut for years. Her skin prickled beneath her sweater. Someone had cracked a joke about the AC being broken. No one laughed. Frost traced delicate vein-like patterns along the edges of the windows, glittering faintly in the morning light. It was late April. The day outside was warm enough for short sleeves. Carla pressed her palm against the glass. It burned with cold. Miss Hampton stood at the front of the room, perfectly still. She hadn't written anything on the board yet. She was just waiting. Her hands were folded at her waist, chalk tucked between her fingers like a cigarette. When she smiled, Carla noticed something that made her stomach twist. She didn't blink. Not once as the students filed in. Not when the bell rang. Not when the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. "Good morning," Miss Hampton said pleasantly. Her breath did not fog the air. The lesson began. The same words. The same cadence. But today, the chalk squealed louder against the board. A shrill, aching sound that set Carla's nerves on edge. As Miss Hampton wrote, fine white dust drifted down like ash, and where it landed on desk, the wood frosted over, the grain paling as if leached of warmth. Carla hugged herself. Her fingers were numb. Halfway through the class, she realized something else. No lunch bag sat on Miss Hampton's desk. No coffee cup, no water bottle. Carla watched her closely as the minutes dragged on. Miss Hampton never swallowed, never licked her lips, never paused to breathe deeper. When the clock ticked toward the end of the period, Carla glanced at the window again and froze. Reflected in the glass behind Miss Hampton was a woman who did not belong in this time. The reflection showed high-collared fabric, dark and severe, sleeves puffed slightly at the shoulders. A silhouette straight out of an old photograph. The face was the same, sharp, pale, but her hair was pinned differently, coiled in a style Carla had only seen in history books. Carla looked back at Miss Hampton. Gray skirt, neat bun, modern shoes. She looked at the window again. Victorian dress, no movement, no blinking eyes. The reflection smiled wider than the woman at the front of the room. The bell rang, loud and jarring. Students jumped in their seats. When Carla looked back at the glass, the reflection was gone. Just her own pale face staring back, breath misting the surface. As the class filed out, Miss Hampton placed a hand on Carla's desk. Cold. Not cool, cold, like stone left outside in winter. "You feel it too," Miss Hampton murmured softly, not a question. The room remembering. Her fingers lingered, leaving frost blooming across the wood. "Don't worry," she added, eyes bright and unblinking. "It gets colder before it becomes permanent." When Carla fled into the hallway, a warmth rushed back into her lungs, but behind her, the door to room 13 clicked shut on its own. Inside, the lesson continued. The storm that Friday morning felt wrong. No thunder, no rain. Just a gray heaviness pressing down on the school roof, as if clouds were sitting there, listening. Carla sat in homeroom with her arms crossed, trying to ignore the scrape of chalk echoing from room 13 through the wall, even though Ms. Hampton's class should have ended an hour ago. When the final bell rang, Carla didn't join the rush of bodies heading for lunch. She walked straight into the administrative office, shoes squeaking on the dull linoleum. The secretary looked up from her computer, blinking behind the thick glasses. "Can I see Principal Davis? It's important." She nodded, half bored, and pressed the intercom. 2 minutes later, Carla was seated in front of the principal's desk, her heart thudding against her ribs. The office smelled of new carpet and old coffee. Ordinary smells that almost made her feel silly for being scared. Mr. Davis looked up from the stack of papers. He was a big man with tired eyes and a forced cheerfulness that came from years of PTA meetings. "So, Ms. Hampton trouble," he said with a half smile. "Our new sub's pretty popular with the other teachers." Carla hesitated. "She's not normal. She's been here for weeks, and no one knows where she came from. The classroom keeps getting colder, and she knew stuff about the school that only..." He raised a hand. "Slow down, Carla. I appreciate your concern, but we did a background check. She's fully certified. Look for yourself." He slid a thin folder across the desk. Inside were photocopies of an ID badge, a certificate, and a completed application. The ink was still fresh. The photo showed Ms. Hampton's same perfect posture, same serene smile, but something about her eyes on paper looked deeper, hungrier. Carla ran her finger down the dates. Employment began March 10th. Her throat tightened. "That's impossible. She was here on March 3rd. Mr. Davis laughed softly, shaking his head. "You've been under stress, haven't you? Exams, deadlines. Don't let an overactive imagination scare you." Carla stood, clutching the folder. "You don't get it. I saw these exact same pages in the archive. Same font. Same date stamps. From 1992. That made him pause. His expression twitched, just slightly, as if a faint sliver of unease slipped past the mask of authority. Then he smiled again, too quickly. "Probably just a mix-up in records. I'll double-check it." When she left the office, the hallway lights flickered, one after another, down the corridor. A cold breath brushed her ear, though she was alone. She turned the corner toward the stairwell. The folder in Carla's hands grew damp, the paper bleeding gray around the edges. She looked down. The ink on Miss Hampton's application was still wet. Monday morning arrived with unnatural brightness. Sunlight poured in through room 13's windows that had been frosted over just days before. The air felt warm, almost cheerful. Students filed in chatting about weekend plans, their voices loose and careless. Carla slid into her desk, muscles tense. Something was different. Miss Hampton stood at the board, chalk poised, wearing what might have been the ghost of a genuine smile. "Good morning, class," she said, and for the first time in weeks, her voice carried actual warmth. "I have wonderful news." She turned, writing in those perfect, looping letters, "Final day, Friday." Relief rippled through the room like a wave. Logan actually whooped. Sophie grinned, nudging Carla's shoulder. "See? Told you she was just a sub." But Carla's stomach remained knotted. Miss Hampton's eyes swept across the class, lingering on each face with something that almost looked like affection. "You've all been such remarkable students. Almost perfect, in fact." She paused, tilting her head. "I rarely find a class so complete." But the word hung in the air like smoke. "We'll spend this last week reviewing everything we've learned together," Miss Hampton continued, her smile widening just slightly. "And Friday, we'll have a special final lesson. just for my most dedicated learners. She began calling on students for attendance. Sophie Ramirez? Here. Logan Clark? Here. David Bennett? Carla's pen stopped. There was no David in their class. She glanced around. No one else seemed to notice. Ms. Hampton's eyes didn't leave her roster. Jennifer Morrison? Another name that didn't belong. Carla's throat went dry. She pulled out her phone under her desk, fingers shaking as she searched the school's old yearbook archives online. David Bennett, missing since 1987. Last seen at Riverside High. Jennifer Morrison, vanished 1993. Lincoln Preparatory. Both schools Miss Hampton had worked at. Both names circled in red ink in her leather satchel. Carla Mendez? She looked up. Ms. Hampton was staring directly at her, chalk still poised against the attendance sheet. In the sunlight, her skin looked translucent, almost see-through, like old parchment stretched too thin. Here, Carla whispered. Ms. Hampton's smile deepened, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too white, too perfect. Yes, she murmured, as if confirming something only she could hear. Yes, you are. She turned back to the board, and beneath the final day she added in smaller script. Final collection. When Carla blinked, the word shifted to Final review session, room 13, 3:15 p.m. Outside the window, the sunlight dimmed. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, pressing against the glass like hands. Miss Hampton began her lesson. A new one, finally. But every word felt like a countdown. The bell for the final period hadn't even finished ringing when Carla felt the weight in her pocket. It wasn't the familiar plastic of her phone, but something stiff and sharp-edged. She reached in and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. The paper was thick, textured like skin, and sealed with a dollop of black wax that bore the imprint of a single unblinking eye. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. The scent of sweet lilies and metallic iron wrench ink wafted from the stationery, clogging her throat. Room 13, 3:15 p.m. Do not be late. The handwriting on the front, Carla Mendez, was so elegant it looked like a threat. Panicked, Carla crumpled the envelope into a tight ball and shoved it deep into the wire mesh of the hallway trash can. She turned and ran toward the bus loop, her only goal to be miles away from Riverside High before the clock struck 3. But when she reached for her bus pass at the gate, her fingers brushed against something stiff. She pulled it out, the cream envelope, uncreased, the black wax eye staring back at her. "I threw you away," she hissed, her voice lost in the roar of departing buses. She ripped the invitation into a dozen pieces, scattering the fragments into the wind. She watched them drift into the gutter, then boarded her bus and sat in the back, pulse hammering. When she reached her house, she bolted inside and slammed the door. She went to her room, desperate to hide under the covers, but as she pulled back the duvet, her heart stopped. Lying on her pillow was the invitation, pristine, whole. Beside it, her vanity mirror was coated in a thin gray film of chalk dust. Traced into the powder was a message in that same looping script. Attendance is mandatory for the perfect. Carla grabbed the invitation and ran to the kitchen, thrusting it into the blue flame of the gas stove. She watched the paper blacken and curl, the iron-smelling ink hissing as it turned to ash. She didn't leave until the last spark died. She retreated to the living room, but the air suddenly turned freezing. The temperature dropped so fast the windows groaned in their frames. She looked down at her lap. The invitation was there, resting on her knees. It was no longer just an envelope. It had opened itself. Inside, the ink was wet, pulsing like a heartbeat. Beneath her name, new lines were forming as she watched. Sophie is already waiting. Logan is already waiting. The lesson is about to begin. Carla realized then that she wasn't being invited. She was being summoned. The house, her room, her very clothes were now part of Ms. Hampton's classroom. There was no outside left to run to. Room 13 should have been empty after school. Instead, the hallway leading to it felt crowded with silence. Carla arrived at 3:12 p.m., heart pounding, the invitation folded tight in her fist like a confession. Sophie stood near the lockers, pale and jittery, eyes darting toward the classroom door. Logan leaned against the wall pretending to scroll his phone, but his foot tapped too fast, too nervous. "You shouldn't be here," Carla whispered. "We need to leave. Now." Before either of them could respond, the door to room 13 creaked open on its own. Warm air rushed out, wrongly warm, heavy with the smell of chalk and iron. Inside, the lights were already on. Miss Hampton stood at the front of the room, hands folded, smiling as if she'd been waiting all afternoon. "Perfect timing," she said. "Please, come in." The moment Carla crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed, then didn't fade, it just hung there, vibrating in the air. Carla spun around and grabbed the handle. There was no door, only a smooth stretch of wall where it had been, painted the same dull institutional beige, unbroken and cold. Logan swore under his breath. Sophie whimpered. Carla backed away, heart hammering, and nearly stumbled over a desk. The classroom looked the same at first, rows of desks, chalkboard, clock above the door, but something was deeply wrong. The windows no longer showed the school grounds. Beyond the glass was an endless gray expanse, like fog without depth or movement. No sky, no ground, just nothing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Then Carla realized it was ticking backward. 3:14, 3:13, 3:12. Miss Hampton turned toward the board and picked up a piece of chalk. "You've done so well," she said fondly. "It's such a relief to teach students who know how to listen." She wrote a date beneath the lesson title, 1897. Carla's breath caught. This school didn't... "It didn't start here," Miss Hampton said gently. "Rooms change, buildings decay, but students," she smiled wider, "students are renewable." She faced them fully now, and for the first time, her reflection didn't match her body at all. In the glass of the windows, she wore a high-collared dress, her skin gray and cracked like dried plaster. Chalk dust sifted constantly from her sleeves, collecting at her feet. "I've been teaching for 127 years, she continued. "Wars, pandemics, fires, new districts, new names." Her eyes fixed on Carla. "The brightest ones always find me." The desk around them began to fill. Students appeared silently in the chairs. Boys and girls wearing outdated clothes, Letterman jackets, denim vests, scrunchies. Hairstyles frozen decades out of time. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, mouths moving in soundless repetition. Writing, erasing, writing again. The same lesson. Forever. Sophie clutched Carla's arm. "They're not aging," she whispered. "No," Miss Hampton said softly. "They stayed." The chalkboard filled on its own, words scrawling rapidly. "Final review. Only perfect answers accepted." Miss Hampton turned back to the class, her smile stretching wider than it should. "Now," she said, tapping the chalk once, twice, once. "Let's see who's ready to graduate." The clock slammed back to 3:15, and the lesson began again. Carla's desk rattled as a girl materialized in the seat beside her. She couldn't have been older than 16, wearing acid-wash jeans and a Bon Jovi t-shirt that should have been vintage but looked freshly pressed. Her name tag, pinned crookedly to her chest, read, "Jennifer Morrison, class of 1993. "Please," Jennifer whispered, her voice thin as tissue paper. "Please just answer wrong." Carla jerked back. Jennifer's eyes were glossy, unfocused, like she was looking through Carla instead of at her. Her lips barely moved when she spoke, as if the words were coming from somewhere else entirely. Across the aisle, a boy in a Letterman jacket leaned forward. David Bennett, 1987, was stitched above the school logo. "We've been trying," he said, his voice cracking with decades of exhaustion. "God, we've been trying to fail." More students flickered into visibility around them. A girl in cat-eye glasses and a plaid skirt from the 50s. A boy with frosted tips and a chain wallet. Each one trapped in the exact moment they'd vanished, preserved like insects in amber. "She asked the same questions," Jennifer continued, her pencil moving automatically across her paper, writing answers she'd written 10,000 times before. "Over and over. We keep getting them right because that's what we're taught. Perfect students, perfect answers." David slammed his fist on the desk. The sound was muffled, wrong, like hitting a wall through a pillow. "But if you fail, if you prove you're not perfect," his eyes found Carla's, desperate and pleading, "the spell breaks. She can't keep you." "That's enough discussion," Miss Hampton said without turning around. Her chalk scratched against the board, writing equations that shifted and changed, letters bleeding into numbers, bleeding into symbols that hurt to look at. Sophie grabbed Carla's hand. Her palm was ice cold. "What do we do?" Logan stared at the paper Miss Hampton had placed on his desk. It was blank except for a single question written in that perfect cursive. "What is the most important lesson you have learned?" "I can't remember anymore," Jennifer whispered, tears tracking down her face. "I can't remember what it was like outside. I can't remember my mother's voice. All I know is this room, this lesson, this—" Miss Hampton turned, her smile radiant and terrible. "Time's up," she announced cheerfully. "Pass your papers forward." The ghost students moved in with perfect synchronization, their hands trembling as they surrendered their work. Each paper was identical, perfect penmanship, perfect answers, perfect damnation. "Now," Miss Hampton said, her eyes settling on Carla, Sophie, and Logan, "let's see if you learned anything at all." She placed blank test on their desk. The chalk dust in the air grew thicker, sweet and suffocating, and Carla understood with crystal clarity. This was the test that would determine whether they left, or whether they stayed forever. Carla stared down at the blank page. The question pulsed faintly in gray ink. "What is the most important lesson you've learned?" Beside her, Logan and Sophie were frozen, pencils trembling midway to paper. All around them, the trapped students whispered their answers in perfect unison. The same phrases, the same rhythm, like a choir long since stripped of breath. Carla picked up her pencil, the wood slick with moisture though her hands were dry. Something clicked behind her eyes, a memory from the whispers of the others. "If you fail, the spell breaks." Across the room, Miss Hampton leaned against her desk, smiling. "Take your time," she purred. "Perfection isn't rushed." The word perfection echoed like a curse. Frost crawled up the windows, sealing the gray void outside. The ticking clock began to speed backward, the numbers twisting in reverse. Carla's heart hammered as the pencil hovered over the paper. Every instinct screamed to get the answer right, to survive by compliance. But she forced her hand to move. She wrote one word: nothing. The sound that followed wasn't a roar or a crash, but the snapping of chalk, sharp enough to split the air. Miss Hampton's smile faltered. The perfect symmetry of the room fractured. The walls wavered, the desk blurred. "What did you write?" the teacher demanded, her voice suddenly deeper, rough with centuries of command. Carla lifted her eyes. "I learned that not every lesson should be finished." Then the frost shattered. Students screamed as the room dissolved into blinding white light. Desks splintered into dust. The chalkboard screamed, the words written there spiraling off the surface like smoke. Ms. Hampton lurched toward Carla, her face flickering between time periods. Victorian, 1950s, 1980s, each older, deader than the last. Carla clutched Sophie's arm and ran. There was no door, but the wall cracked under her like thin ice, bursting into color and warmth. She fell forward, onto the hallway floor of Riverside High. The bell rang. Teachers passed by. Everything was normal. Almost. Carla scrambled up. Sophie lay gasping beside her, blinking like she'd just surfaced from deep water. Logan wasn't there. Room 13's door hung open behind them. Empty desk. A clean board. No frost. For one brief moment, Carla thought she had made it out. Then she saw, through the office window, Miss Hampton standing in the parking lot. Perfect hair, flawless smile, handing an envelope to Principal Davis. The emblem on the envelope wasn't the school seal. It was a black wax eye. Carla turned to run down the hall, but a familiar voice stopped her. "Ms. Mendez? The art teacher called in sick," said Sophie, stepping away from the doorway. Her tone was calm, pleasant, authoritative. "The district just sent over my substitute papers." Her lips curved into Miss Hampton's exact smile. "Now, shall we begin the next lesson?" If you enjoyed this nightmare, subscribe for more. New stories dropping every week. Sleep well, if you can.